to EM Wolfman. Hello to our audience at home and in the future. This is Keep, Begin, Detach, inspired by Virginia Woolf. So a little bit about me. I am an artist type person located here in Oakland, California. I have lived here for 3 years and I really love living in Oakland. One of the very first places I felt completely relaxed about is EM Wolfman, and I've been hosting events here for a few times. Yeah, and so this I think is our 7th installation in this series, Keep, Begin, Detach. Some past inspiring artists: Yoko Ono, Pauline Oliveros, Laurie Anderson, Emily Dickinson, just to name a few. But yes, I picked Virginia Woolf because, after all this time, I haven't featured a fiction writer. And lately I've been getting into fiction, and specifically, someone recommended this book, A Room of One's Own, and it really fascinated me because I feel like it's still relevant. The thing about that book is it's a kind of like essay that meanders a bit, and it's like a book shape. And so it's interesting that Virginia Woolf tackles this idea about women writing fiction in her day and age, where it takes a little more than the average person has. Oh, hello. Welcome. You can go ahead and look at this. You can leaf through it while I'm talking. I like having it just as a fun souvenir, but also I'm going to be reading from it. That is a great take home for your friends who could not make it tonight and love Virginia Woolf. So let's get right into it. The zine that I'm handing out to my attendee is something I made where it's like a reader. I took some notes on Virginia Woolf's Wikipedia page that I always find really helpful for these events, because Wikipedia is very thorough in doing all the name dropping and the linking and kind of giving context to these historical figures. And I'll talk a little bit more about my notes in a second, but I also wanted to mention that the rest of the zine contains a couple of book reviews, and then beginning chapter from The Voyage Out, and 2 full short stories from Monday or Tuesday. I didn't know Virginia Woolf wrote short stories, or at least published them, so it was really great to find all this stuff. Doing my research is interesting, just typing in the name of what I was looking for, and then PDF. Turns out Project Gutenberg is very thorough, and it is in different countries. And so it's interesting searching one database for a thing and then not having it, but then searching the whole internet and then finding it somewhere else. Because this zine contains from Project Gutenberg Canada and Project Gutenberg Australia, as well as America. Have you had experience with this?
With Project Gutenberg?
Yeah.
Not very much. Nothing. I have no good stories about it if I do.
Yeah, it's pretty wild, because I don't recommend reading on the screen if I can help it. But the idea of being able to just print it is pretty cool. Kind of weird. Like, what is this day and age where you can print parts of a book and put it in another little book? But here we are. I like it, and it's kind of an ode to Virginia Woolf's The Common Reader. She made a reader of other people's works, and I started to read it, and it was pretty dry. But that's part of the thing about researching these people in history, is that the language is so different that it's requiring the vocabulary that just isn't there for it to be fully engaging. And so it's kind of interesting, there is a barrier, within our culture these huge gaps that when we try to visit the past, it's like visiting another country. Anyways, I'm gonna get into the history, but before I do, does you have a question before I get started?
No questions at this time.
Cool. Yeah, sometimes I like to ask people like what they already know about Virginia Woolf, but I'm not gonna do that this time, because I do want to just like remind myself what I have learned and wrote down, but also you know, I'm so excited. Okay, so let's turn ourselves into the zine if you want to follow along. It's after the welcome page. You'll see a page that just says Virginia Woolf, and then outline that's like 1A, 2A, etc. So that was me just kind of getting some notes down, and I initially titled this numbered list as Factors for Writerly Successes and Inclinations. And then I just retitled it Virginia Woolf. But the idea is that I was going through her bio on Wikipedia and thinking about how did she become such a household name, like one of the parents of stream of consciousness writing in the modern era of literature. And so it's always a little interesting and kind of disappointing to find out that these people have like a lot to stand on. Virginia Woolf being an example of somebody who came from an affluent family, and even though they didn't have like the most money in the world, they her father was a writer and a scholar and had a big library, and so his sons went off to Cambridge for college, and Virginia Woolf got tutored at home by her parents, but then later went to like a woman's department at King's College in New York. Or sorry, London. Why did I say New York? Anyways, so I think that it's interesting kind of feeling like whenever I do these events, I'm always just like, who are the men that really helped these women get to be as famous as they are? And so Virginia Woolf's stepbrothers, or half-brothers, were the Cambridge Fellows that then later they formed this group of people called the Bloomsbury Set. Have you heard of the Bloomsbury Set?
I don't think so.
Yeah, it's also called the Bloomsbury Group. But yeah, they're kind of like the original Bohemians. They had this idea that they all wanted to write a novel. I mean, separately, like they all had ambitions to write a novel, and so they would meet weekly and share chapters and have dinner. And I think that's a big deal, because having a community that supports you and encourages you really changes the game, especially when like their goals are similar, so they have a lot to say because their process is similar and their resources are juicy because they're like stuff you want to know about. Anyways, yeah, so I was also intrigued by how this group was also very they say incestuous in the Wikipedia article, but I mean that's just like a prudent way of saying that they were very liberated to enjoy each other's company. And I had a great time. There's this really great like family tree, but it's just like who had a crush on who and who married who and who dated who. And it's so cute and sad because there's like, you know, dashed lines for unrequited love and little dots for crush, and then it's just friendship, and oh, it was so great. But yeah, I like those kinds of things where it's just like these people like really cared about each other and were very smart and educated and unfettered by the idea of a certain way to be, and I think it really helped them express their points of view and pursue their callings. But yeah, So moving on. So Virginia Woolf was Virginia Stephen. Before she was Virginia Woolf, she married Leonard Woolf, who was in the Bloomsbury group, and he was more on the political writing kind of thing. But yeah, so they formed a press called the Hogarth Press, and they had a small press, a printing kit that they had on their dining room table, and they would make little books. They described it as like 32 pagers with like 2 short stories or something like that, and like a wood block for the frontispiece. Sorry. This is the weirdest, where it's just like one person that is like the Mr. Wolfman. It's like really funny because it's just like this is your first Cupid and Detach I've ever seen you at.
Yeah, it might be. I've seen it before, but you guys were busy doing stuff.
Oh, okay.
Stopped by.
Yeah, so it's just like such a different experience. Anyways, long story short, I like the idea of these small bindings. One of the people that the Hogarth Press published was T.S. Eliot, which I thought was really cool.
Yeah.
I like him. There were some other people. But yeah, it was for people that are unconventional at different points of view. And I like the feeling about today's day and age where anyone can kind of like be published on the internet, but then also like have access to a copier or printer. And so, later on in their years after the war, they got back together, some of them, for another version of the Bloomsbury set called the Memoir Club. And I just like this idea of kind of like regrouping and getting your like community together to really help you sit on your projects. So I think one thing that Virginia Woolf is most known for was her mental health or mental illness. And I think it's important to talk about because, a lot of creative people sometimes will have mental issues or like heightened experiences, or maybe it's just a lot of people do, but it's just people that express themselves in a certain way get remembered in history differently. So what I read is that it sounds like Virginia Woolf's dad had some issues with stress and being kind of frayed around the edges in terms of nerves and stuff. But also Virginia Woolf had some issues with her half-brothers potentially being abusive, though the record doesn't show it as clearly, and they kind of discredit Virginia Woolf's accounts a little bit. And so it's just kind of one of those things that is a little lost in history, but I definitely think that something happened to her when she was young. But then also she experienced a lot of grief from her parents dying while she was a teenager, and so it's just like as she was developing, she had a lot of stress and grief, and it really changes a person. So throughout Virginia Woolf's life, she experienced bouts of depression and psychosis and tried to kill herself a couple of times. And she succeeded the last time. She left behind a suicide letter note. And I thought it was really poetic and sweet, but also kind of sad, because the way that she phrased it, she just didn't want to be a burden on her husband anymore. And I feel like that's still a problem in today's day and age, is feeling like you're burdening your one relationship, and it's not a community endeavor or a society endeavor to keep people afloat and keep them healthy or in a state of being able to survive without feeling like you're just hurting one person for your flaws, your brokenness, or your lack of stability. And so that really hit me in her book, A Room of One's Own. Virginia Woolf talks about how to write fiction, but I think in general, just to flourish creatively, you should have your own room, and I think something like $500 a week. I'm not sure about all the like money stuff because it was in pounds when I read it, and then the annotated version tried to translate it, but it got confusing a little bit. But anyways, I think that stuff is really relevant as automation eliminates a lot of jobs, and there's going to be people that aren't working, and it's just they're not going to be supported, and things are going to fall away, and we just need universal basic income. That's just, I think, a reality that is hard to face, because I think people won't get there, and there will be a dystopian lull before we come to our senses as a society. But I'm a little pessimistic. Anyhow, so that's my take on Virginia Woolf's history in a little nutshell. Any questions? Or anything that you're wondering about that you thought I might have learned about and didn't say so?
Yeah, was there like a time when she was really productive, or did she write all of her life? You know what I mean? Did she write when she was young, or?
Oh, yes. So what I think is really sweet is that, she would read and write at home, and she and her sister would make little like chronicles of the house, and I always think that stuff is really cute because it's just like making productions just for yourself or your family is really great. She had a diary, she had a notebook, and she wrote pretty much like her whole life. Sometimes like taking a break. I guess it's hard to really remember what exactly I read about the pace of it, but let me read you this quote. So another thing about this whole thing is that the era was prone to letter writing, but especially like a well-to-do household like Virginia Woolf's growing up, like writing letters to people was a common occurrence. And there's so many like books of Virginia Woolf's letters to people. And what I read was that she would often write in her diary sad things, and then when she wrote to other people, she would write happy things. And so there's kind of like interesting thing that happens when you're writing by yourself. Like you can kind of like flesh out some of the feelings that you wouldn't want to tell someone, but you want to still write about. But anyways, I'm going to read a little excerpt from a letter to a composer named Ethel Smythe, one of her friends. And it's about a little bit about madness. And here we go. As an experience, madness is terrific, I can assure you, and not to be sniffed at. And in its lava, I still find most of the things I write about. It shoots out of one everything-shaped final, not mere driblets, as sanity does. And in the 6 months, not 3, that I lay in bed taught me a good deal about what is called oneself. And so I get from that the impression that in her ways of madness, she would write things and read them and then understand something. And I think it can be really powerful. And so, that's my impression, is that she wrote a lot. One of the things that I read was that her lover told her that it's probably best not to do like physical activity when she's feeling stressed out, but writing is a great way to calm yourself down and to kind of like chill the nerves and whatever. So I imagine that somebody as neurotic as Virginia Woolf wrote for those reasons too, and then would write a lot. Thank you for the question. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and read one of the two short stories from the book Monday or Tuesday, and it's in the zine here. And then I'll kind of wrap up the evening. Yeah, okay, so we're gonna go ahead and start. This one is called Kew Gardens. From the oval-shaped flower bed, there rose perhaps 100 stalks spreading into heart-shaped or tongue-shaped leaves halfway up and unfurling at the tip in red or blue or yellow petals marked with spots of color raised upon the surface. And from the red, blue, or yellow gloom of the throat emerged a straight bar, rough with gold dust and slightly clubbed at the end. The petals were voluminous enough to be stirred by the summer breeze, and when they moved, the red, blue, and yellow lights passed one over the other, staining an inch of the brown earth beneath with a spot of the most intricate color. The light fell either upon the smooth gray back of a pebble or the shell of a snail with its brown circular veins, or falling into a raindrop. It expanded with such intensity of red, blue, and yellow the thin walls of water that one expected them to burst and disappear. Instead, the drop was left in a second silver gray once more, and the light now settled upon the flesh of a leaf, revealing the branching thread of fiber beneath the surface. And again it moved on and spread its illumination into the vast green spaces beneath the dome of the heart-shaped and tongue-shaped leaves. Then the breeze stirred rather more briskly overhead, and the color was flashed into the air above, into the eyes of the men and women who walk in Kew Gardens in July. Let's take a quick breather. It's hot up here. It's like a few paragraphs more, so get comfortable. You can follow along with your zine, or you can close your eyes and imagine this garden. The figures of these men and women straggled past the flower bed with a curiously irregular movement, not unlike that of the white and blue butterflies who crossed the turf in zigzag flights from bed to bed. The man was about 6 inches in front of the woman, strolling carelessly while she bore on with greater purpose, only turning her head now and then to see that the children were not too far behind. The man kept this distance in front of the woman purposely, though perhaps unconsciously, for he wished to go on with his thoughts. 15 years ago, I came here with Lily, he thought. We sat somewhere over there by a lake, and I begged her to marry me all through the hot afternoon. How the dragonfly kept circling round us. How clearly I see the dragonfly in her shoe with the square silver buckle at the toe. All the time I spoke, I saw her shoe, and when it moved impatiently, I knew without looking up what she was going to say. The whole of her seemed to be in her shoe, and my love, my desire were in the dragonfly. For some reason I thought that if it settled there on that leaf, the broad one with the red flower in the middle of it, if the dragonfly settled on the leaf, she would say yes at once. But the dragonfly went round and round. It never settled anywhere. Of course not. Happily not. Or I shouldn't be walking here with Eleanor and the children. Tell me, Eleanor, did you ever think of the past? Why do you ask, Simon? Because I've been thinking of the past. I've been thinking of Lily, the woman I might have married. Well, why are you silent? Do you mind my thinking of the past? Why should I mind, Simon? Doesn't one always think of the past in a garden with men and women lying under the trees? Aren't they one's past? All that remains of it, those men and women, those ghosts lying under the trees, one's happiness, one's reality? For me, a square silver shoe buckle and a dragonfly. For me, a kiss. Imagine 6 little girls sitting before their easels 20 years ago down by the side of a lake, painting the water lilies, the first red water lilies I'd ever seen. And suddenly a kiss there on the back of my neck, and my hand shook all the afternoons that I couldn't paint. I took out my watch and marked the hour when I would allow myself to think of the kiss for 5 minutes only. It was so precious. The kiss of an old, gray-haired woman with a wart on her nose, the mother of all my kisses all my life. Come, Caroline, come, Hubert. They walked past the flower bed, now walking 4 abreast, and soon diminished in size among the trees, and looked half transparent as the light and shade swam over their backs in large, trembling, irregular patches. In the oval flower bed, the snail, whose shell had been stained red, blue, and yellow for the space of 2 minutes or so, now appeared to be moving very slightly in its shell, and began to labor over the crumbs of loose earth, which broke away and rolled down as it passed over them. It appeared to have a definite goal in front of it, differing in this respect from the singular, high-stepping, angular green insect who attempted to cross in front of it and waited for a second with its antennae trembling as if in deliberation, and then stepped off rapidly and strangely in the opposite direction. Brown cliffs with deep green lakes in the hollows, flat blade-like trees that waved from root to tip, round boulders of gray stone, vast crumpled surface of a thin, crackling texture. All of these objects laid across the snail's progress between one stalk and another to his goal. Before he had decided whether to circumvent the arched tent of a dead leaf or to breast it, there came past the bed the feet of 4 other human beings. This time they were both men. The younger of the 2 wore an expression of perhaps unnatural calm. He raised his eyes and fixed them very steadily in front of him while his companion spoke, and directly his companion had done some speaking, he looked on the ground again and sometimes opened his lips only after a long pause, and sometimes did not open them at all. The elder man had a curiously uneven and shaky method of walking, jerking his hand forward and throwing up his head abruptly, rather in the manner of an impatient carriage horse tired of waiting outside a house. But in the man these gestures were irresolute and pointless. He talked almost incessantly. He smiled to himself and again began to talk, as if the smile had been an answer. He was talking about spirits, the spirits of the dead, who, according to him, were even now telling him all sorts of odd things about their experiences in heaven. Heaven was known to the ancients as Thessaly William, and now with this war the spirit matter is rolling between the hills like thunder. He paused, seemed to listen, smiled, jerked his head, and continued. You have a small electric battery and a piece of rubber to insulate the wire. Isolate, insulate. Well, we'll skip the details. No good going into details that wouldn't be understood. And in short, the little machine stands in any convenient position by the head of the bed, we will say, on a neat mahogany stand. All arrangements being properly fixed by a workman under my direction. The widow applies her ear and summons the spirit by sign as agreed. Women, widows, women in black. Here he seemed to have caught a sight of a woman's dress in the distance, which in the shade looked like a purple black. He took off his hat, placed his hand upon his heart and hurried towards her, muttering and gesticulating feverishly. But William caught him by the sleeve and touched a flower with the tip of his walking stick in order to divert the old man's attention. After looking at it for a moment in some confusion, the old man bent his ear to it and seemed to answer a voice speaking from it, for he began talking about the forests of Uruguay, which he had visited hundreds of years ago in company with the most beautiful young woman in Europe. He could be heard murmuring about forests of Uruguay blanketed with the wax petals of tropical roses, nightingales, sea beaches, mermaids, and women drowned at sea, as he suffered himself to be moved on by William, upon whose face the look of a stoical patience grew slowly deeper and deeper. Following his steps so closely as to be slightly puzzled by his gestures came two elderly women of the lower middle class, one stout and ponderous, the other rosy-cheeked and nimble. Like most people of their station, they were quite frankly fascinated by any signs of eccentricity betokening a disordered brain, especially in the well-to-do, but they were far off to be certain whether the gestures were merely eccentric or genuinely mad. After they scrutinized the old man's back in silence for a moment and given each other a queer sly look, they went on energetically piecing together their very complicated dialogue. "Nell Bert Lot says, Phil Pa, he says, I says, she says, I says, I says, I says. My Bert says, Bill Granddad, the old man, sugar. Sugar, flour, kippers, creams, sugar, sugar, sugar." The ponderous woman looked through the pattern of falling words at the flowers standing cool, firm, and upright in the earth with a curious expression. She saw them as a sleeper waking from a deep sleep sees a brass candlestick reflecting the light in an unfamiliar way and closes his eyes and opens them, and seeing the brass candlestick again, finally starts broad awake and stares at the candlestick with all his powers. So the heavy woman came to a standstill opposite the oval-shaped flower bed and ceased even to pretend to listen to what the other woman was saying. She stood there letting the words fall over her, swaying the top part of her body, slowly backwards and forwards, looking at the flowers. Then she suggested that they should find a seat and have their tea. The snail had now considered every possible method of reaching his goal without going around the dead leaf or climbing over it, let alone the effort needed for climbing a leaf. He was doubtful whether the thin texture which vibrated with such an alarming crackle when touched even by the tip of his horns would bear his weight, and this determined him finally to creep beneath it, for there was a point where the leaf curved high enough from the ground to admit him. He had just inserted his head in the opening and was taking stock of the high brown roof and getting used to the cool brown light when two other people came outside on the turf. This time they were both young, a young man and a young woman. They were both in the prime of youth, or even in that season which precedes the prime of youth, the season before the smooth pink folds of the flower have burst their gummy case, when the wings of the butterfly, though fully grown, are motionless in the sun. "Lucky it isn't Friday," he observed. "Why, do you believe in luck?" "They make you pay 6 pence on Friday." "What's 6 pence anyway? Isn't it worth 6 pence?" "What's it? What do you mean by it?" "Oh, anything. I mean, you know what I mean." Long pauses came between each of these remarks. They were uttered in toneless and monotonous voices. The couple stood still on the edge of the flower bed and together pressed the end of her parasol deep into the soft earth. The action and the fact that his hand rested on the top of hers expressed their feelings in a strange way. These short, insignificant words also expressed something. Words with short wings for their heavy body of meaning, inadequate to carry them far and thus alighting awkwardly upon the very common objects that surrounded them, and were to their inexperienced touch so massive. But who knows? So they thought as they pressed the parasol into the earth. What precipices aren't concealed in them, or what slopes of ice don't shine in the sun on the other side? Who knows? Who has ever seen this before? Even when she wondered what sort of tea they gave you at Q, he felt that something loomed up behind her words and stood vast and solid behind them, and the mist very slowly rose and uncovered. Oh heavens, what were those shapes? Little white tables and waitresses who looked first at her and then at him, and there was a bill that he would pay with a real 2-shilling piece. And it was real, all real, he assured himself, fingering the coin in his pocket. Real to everyone, except to him and to her. Even to him it began to seem real. And then, but it was too exciting to stand and to think any longer, and he pulled the parasol out of the earth with a jerk and was impatient to find a place where one had tea with other people like other people. Come on, Trissy, it's time we had our tea. Wherever does one have one's tea? She asked with the oddest thrill of excitement in her voice, looking vaguely round and letting herself be drawn on down the grass path, trailing her parasol, turning her head this way and that way, forgetting her tea, wishing to go down there and then down there, remembering orchids and cranes among wildflowers, a Chinese pagoda, and a crimson-crested bird, but he bore her on. Thus one couple after another, with much the same irregular and aimless movement, passed the flower bed and were enveloped in layer after layer of green-blue vapor, in which at first their bodies had substance and a dash of color, but then later both substance and color dissolved into the green-blue atmosphere. How hot it was, so hot that even the thrush chose to hop like a mechanical bird in the shadow of the flowers, with long pauses between one movement and the next, instead of rambling vaguely like the white butterflies danced one above the other, making their white shifting flakes the outline of a shattered marble column above the tallest flowers. The glass roofs of the palm house shone as if a whole market full of shiny green umbrellas had opened in the sun, and the drone of the airplane, the voice of the summer sky, murmured its fierce soul. Yellow and black, pink and snow white, shapes of all these colors, men, women, and children were spotted for a second upon the horizon, and then seeing the breadth of yellow that lay upon the grass, they wavered and sought shade beneath the trees, dissolving like water, like drops of water in the yellow and green atmosphere, staining it faintly with red and blue. It seemed as if all gross and heavy bodies had sunk down into the heat motionless and lay huddled upon the ground, but their voices went wavering from them as if they were flames lolling from the thick waxen bodies of candles. Voices. Yes, voices, wordless voices, breaking the silence suddenly with such depth of contentment, such passion of desire, or in the voices of children, such freshness of surprise. Breaking the silence, but there was no silence. All the time the motor omnibuses were turning their wheels and changing their gear, like a vast nest of Chinese boxes, all of wrought steel turning ceaselessly one within another, the city murmured, on the top of which the voices cried aloud and the petals of myriads of flowers flash their colors into the air.
Woo!
Oh my gosh, that was a long one. Thank you all for bearing with me. And that was Kew Gardens by Virginia Woolf. And that felt really great. I like that feeling of really being able to take my time with it. I always recommend people to read out loud at home because it really allows you to focus on each word and think about, the feeling of approaching a word that you haven't seen in a while, and it's really fun. Like when I saw myriads, I was like, yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, pretty much any word with a Y that's not at the end. It's like, oh well, okay, let's see what's going on here. Anyways, those are my impressions. But yeah, Virginia Woolf was pretty cool about that story. She said that it was one of the more successful ones of the short story book. That one and the other one that I included those two because they were like marked as the successful ones of all of the short stories in Monday or Tuesday. And so perhaps you will find yourself wanting to read the other one at home or reading this one again. So the other one is called The Mark on the Wall. And so what I think is nice about these kinds of moments is that in these short stories, it's really about expanding time and appreciating the small details in this kind of like dreamlike state that she creates with her writing. All right, and so I'm gonna wrap things up, and before I do, I always try to make room for any kind of like performance or thing you're working on, or just like a thing you might want to like perform for the group. And so I thought I'd turn it to you, audience member. Would you be interested in taking the mic and trying out something while we have this kind of container?
Not today, thank you. Thank you for that.
Good.
Thank you for opening the space, but I'm
Yeah. No, I hear that. Yeah. It's definitely a weird time in the bookstore today, folks. Yeah. No, I haven't had an event quite like this because sometimes like I'll have like a friend who shows up and then like another friend like show up, and so it's so funny to just be like, this is it. Anyways, I mean, not to say that this wasn't great.
Yeah,
I'm
this
just
is
saying
great.
like it's such a whole different like thing, because it's like I just haven't done this since last season, so it's just like that feeling of like, well, did I forget to do anything that I wanted to do? Yeah. Anyways, I think my takeaway for everyone in my closing statement, which this is that if you feel like you know people that want to work on something for them and you want to work on something for you, having co-working groups, having feedback groups, all these things create like a sense of community, but then also give yourself kind of deadlines. That's one of the reasons why I have Keep, Begin, Detach. It's like a firm deadline for me to really like get into what are these people about and how can I be prepared enough to tell someone else about it. Anyways, so thank you, and to EM Wolfman and to everyone at home that's seeing this later and enjoying Virginia Woolf's words. Let's just think about what do we want to write and what letters we want to write to other people and what diary entries are waiting to be born. Thank you.
Woo!
Time to pack it up. Good time.